Hey YouTube, how's it going? Today I want to do a song, Deconstruction, for a great song that just came out. This is called Eastside. It's produced by Benny Blanco, along with a couple of other guys actually. I actually looked it up on genius.com, and it's also produced by Andrew Watt and Kashmir Kat. This is a great song to do deconstruction for because these guys are certified hitmakers. Nothing is accidental about the choices that were made in everything from the arrangement to the lyrics to the literary structure, verses, choruses. Everything is just as it should be. And the mix just sounds awesome. And I actually looked it up, and it was mixed by Serban Genea. I think that's how you say it. This guy pretty much mixes all the #1 pop hits. I'm going to share a link to his news page where you can see it's pretty much every single Billboard #1 credit you can think of. This guy mixed. I'm not going to go super into detail about any particular thing about this song as much as just try and kind of give you a nice overview of everything to do with the arrangement, song structure, mix notes. Obviously, I'm in no position to make any kind of criticism about the mix. I'm just going to point out things that I think work really well. And really, I think what you can get out of this video is hopefully some things you can incorporate into your own songwriting, into your own music production. And I'm going to actually spell those out towards the end, and also give you a couple of ideas for exercises that you can basically use to train yourself to get better at this stuff. So I'm not going to play the whole song through. I'm going to share a link to the Spotify, Apple Music, whatever you're into. You can check it out for yourself. It's just a great, catchy song. Let me start off by just kind of pointing out a few of the obvious things, and I'm going to use some notes on the screen here. It's okay if you can't read them. I'm going to share them as well. So first of all, high level, obviously a pop song, heavily influenced by what's last few years been pretty big in the EDM scene, which is tropical house. If you guys know artists like Kygo, also kind of similar to what some of the reggaeton guys, Diplo, DJ Snake are doing. I would say already at this point, this is not an accidental choice. This is very much a summer genre, and the whole vibe of this song, I would say, is kind of an end of summer song. And again, I don't think that's accidental. If you look at when it was released, I think this is very much trying to hit that spot for, 20-somethings, teenagers just finishing their summer, getting over maybe some kind of, broken heart situation, stuff like that. The key is F sharp minor. I'm going to get into that when I talk about the mix, but this is actually a pretty good key if you're going to do a kind of a clubby tune that needs some nice subs. As you'll see in terms of frequency range, this is a great root note, around 46 hertz. For the kind of subby root, which is just awesome for huge clubs speakers. This is actually a very nicely reproducible on large speaker systems. So already there, this is a nice takeaway. Think about the key your song is. Is it really good for the kind of medium that you expect it to be delivered at? Obviously, it needs to work for the singers as well. So maybe that's why it's an F sharp and not a G. But definitely nowadays, when you're going for a big production sound, that's a key decision. Song duration, on the slightly shorter side, I would say 2 minutes, 51 seconds. And this is another kind of great takeaway right off the bat about, I would say, the arrangement. This whole song is based on a 2-bar loop, really. If you will just listen to the intro. That's pretty much it. That loop just goes out literally throughout the song. I went ahead and I kind of tried to just put out, I would say, the logical pieces that make up this song. Obviously, I'm sure I missed a lot of the layering and some smaller elements that are harder to hear, but I think I got most of it right. So pretty much this just guitar loop that's laid with a nice kind of plucky, paddy, vibey synth, I would say, go throughout the whole song. This is a really great example of how you can take a 2-bar loop, maybe some instrumental, maybe a guitar loop, and make it into a whole song. So if nothing else, I would say main takeaway from this is that this is just a study in how to do that. Going a little further, let's see what else is interesting. I would say, yeah. So I would just call this a condensed pop format. If we look a little bit at the actual format, I went ahead and put some markers in. 4-bar intro, pretty standard nowadays. You can go with 4, you can go with 8. For a song like this, where you just have a repetitive loop, you want to kind of go on the shorter side, not make things too repetitive. 8-bar verse, 8-bar pre-chorus, 8-bar chorus. That's pretty much it. So if you look at if you listen to the song, you'll see that it's pretty much verse, pre-chorus, chorus, verse, pre-chorus, chorus, bridge, and outro. Notably, there's no, usually this kind of song, after the bridge, you'd go into a third chorus that's maybe like a double chorus, and that's really where it kind of peaks. In this case, they chose not to go with it. Again, I think this is a nice example, a nice takeaway from this is if you're going to have a song that's entirely based on a 2-bar loop, try and cut it on the shorter side. I mean, the more repetition you have, the more you're starting to get into territory where listeners might be like, kind of fatigued with how repetitive the loop is. So that's another pretty good choice, I would say, in terms of the song structure. Going a little further into details, one thing to point out, I think a lot of the kind of how the monotony is being broken here is just about the little accents. And notably for me, a lot of these accents actually come from vocals. I call these glitch vocals, or like vocal effects. So, you can kind of look at where I put down these little markers here and kind of listen to the song and try and see if you can hear what's happening in the background there. Got that kind of shout, background vocals. When I was young. So these are pretty much kind of peppered throughout the whole song. Great, right there, great way to add variety and fill in kind of dead spaces, gaps in your song. And even right there, I actually noticed that almost all of these little kind of male vocal shouts or fill-ins are slightly different. So that's another way to add interest to the song. I'll just play you through a couple of them and just kind of try and see if you can tell that these are all slightly different variations on these kind of vocal throws. Then we go back of the bush. Oh, hey. If you we can go anywhere. So, just kind of think about it as once you have the song laid out, now you can start adding these little pieces of flavor in. This is another great way to take a 2-bar loop, make it more interesting. Moving on a little bit, let's talk about just a little bit the vibe. I think that's maybe more interesting to you guys who are into songwriting than music production, but I think it's important to keep in mind for both. Generally, and I'm going to go and use some pretty highfalutin words here, but I would say this is kind of an understated vibe, sensual but cool, kind of calm and collected. It's reflective, it's reminiscent, it's not dramatic or agonizing. So I would say it very much speaks to the kind of millennial zeitgeist, to the kind of mindset that a lot of us in their mid-20s to mid-30s kind of have right now. It doesn't try and go too over the top with anything. All the feels, all the drums, everything, the vocals, everything is kind of just cool. It's not too much. I think this is something to keep in mind, whatever it is you're doing nowadays. Try and listen to a lot of modern productions and see if you can pick up how they kind of balance this sense of drama and energy flow while keeping it kind of not too over the top. I think that's a mainstay of the last few years of popular songwriting. We all grew up with the internet. We all know what what sounds kind of like overdone and cheesy. So obviously these guys are doing a great job walking that fine line, making sure nothing here sounds cheesy. Let's put it that way. I mentioned the subs. I think wasn't a coincidental choice. If you know anything a little bit about frequency spectrum, which hopefully you do if you're watching this tutorial, otherwise a lot of it won't make sense to you. I'll just point out that the root F sharp, you got the F sharp, probably the lowest one is at 23 hertz, which is, probably the lowest that you'd go on a speaker system that tries to reproduce it. But the nice thing about it is that if you even go up an octave and you're at 46 hertz, that right there is still pretty much sub territory. So you actually have a chance to kind of have an octave really within the sub range, which is one thing that makes this kind of choice of key pretty good. The lowest note this song hits in terms of bass is D, but as you'll see, they don't actually hit on this D0, which is 18 hertz, which is pretty much rumble at that point and takes up way too much energy in the mix. So as you'll see, there was an interesting arrangement choice, or maybe it was during mix time, where that D is really not played out. So once the subs go into this kind of chord progression, they actually jump up to here. Let me just try and play you quickly this kind of a sub reconstruction I've done. And you know, I definitely didn't try and reconstruct the whole song exactly. I just tried to pick up a few elements that were interesting and kind of try and roughly get them. So if you listen to the sub. So I don't know if you can tell by that last chord, the D, that's kind of that higher octave D. So it sounds something like. Something like that. That's kind of how it sounded like to me. See if you can pick it apart for yourself. And while we're on the subject of bass and subs, most mixes, you got to make a choice between the kick and the bass. Who's going to be more subby? In this song, I think it's pretty clear that the sub bass, obviously, as the name would suggest, won out. The kick is not too subby. The kick is pretty great, though. And one thing that stood out to me about this kick, which I really like, and I think it's kind of another kind of hallmark of this tropical house genre, it seems to have some kind of offset between the bottom and the body and that kind of crack at the top. And by offset, I mean some kind of small, few millisecond shift. And it gives it this really cool effect that just makes it way more present in the track. See if you can hear what I'm talking about. Let's just listen to a couple of seconds. And every day very subtle. I think you need to listen to it quite a few times, and you can just go to Splice or some other website, browse through some tropical house kick drums. I'll post a link to a couple that I think are good, and on those ones you can really tell it. So I think they just take a hi-hat, they layer it, and then they kind of move it around by a few milliseconds to kind of come in a little bit before the main kick body. But the nice thing, and I think this is kind of what's happening here, is that you don't have to do it only with the hi-hat overlay. You can also take like a kind of a more punchy or low-end kick with around 100 hertz, and then overlay it with a little more body. I would say more of an acoustic kick body that has a bit more of interesting things going between 200 and 400 hertz, and even just take that body and kind of offset it. And I try to do something like that. I don't think I got it exactly right, but I got a pretty nice kick out of it. I'll share that sample too if you guys like it. You can just compare it for yourself. I'm going to just play the song for a few seconds, then switch to my kick, and I think I got the mood right. Shine the city with a sun on. Let me ride through the back streets of a blue Corvette. So another interesting thing about sound design, I'm really not going to go into too many details about sound design in this song, but if I was to say one thing, it's the kick, obviously, in these kind of clubby tracks, pop tracks, is one of the most important elements, other than the vocals, of course, and the subs. So spend a lot of time on the kick. Make sure it's big, it's present, it sits well with the bass. I think that was definitely done in this case. Moving on a little bit, there's a lot to cover. Let me just try and kind of point out some of the main things. We talked a little bit about the vocal accents, about the bass, about the subs. Another important thing that I'm getting out of this song is how to kind of, create energy movement. So we mentioned that this is pretty much a 2-bar loop, right? So how do you build a whole song around that? So the answer is, and I think this was done pretty well here, you can kind of try and look at the frequency spectrum and make sure that you expand and contract it based on where you want the energy to go. So if I kind of listen to the arrangement and basically look at the reverse engineering that I've done here, then you can kind of see that it starts off pretty mellow. There's no sub. Midway through the first verse, there's this bass that comes in that sounds more like an electric bass to me. Not really subby. I know your daddy didn't like me much, and he didn't believe. Just adds a little bit of bottom. And then in the pre-chorus, you're really getting into this kind of subby bass territory. But you can also do the same thing on the higher frequencies. So what they did here, which is pretty cool, is that towards the middle of the first pre-chorus, and then throughout the first chorus, as well as the later pre-chorus and chorus, they add this kind of overlay. I'd call it the top loop, just more like high frequency elements like snares and hi-hats that add this kind of much more sparkly, bright kind of layer on top of the drum. So let me just play you a few seconds right here and you can tell when it comes in.
Baby, you know I just wanna leave tonight. We can go anywhere we want. Drop down to the coast, jump in the sea. Just take my hand and come with me.
So pretty great technique, I would say, you know, on top of just adding all these little vocal throws, as well as these little elements that they threw out, like these little reverse sweeps and cymbal hits. Play around with your frequency spectrum, you know, make sure that you're starting off not full blast, so maybe you have room to grow into both in the sub territory as well as the high frequencies. Very important. Another element for building energy, and again, in a very nice and understated way, this is not a full-blown EDM track, so you know they're not going nuts here, but they're doing it very effectively. So adding some drum breaks, if you look at the pre-chorus and the verse, and this is true for both verses and both pre-chorus sections, there's a very short, just kind of drum break right before the chorus hits. It's a great way to add energy. Obviously, there's kind of a short drop, and then it just kind of, your ear perceives it as a much more accentuated kind of energy buildup once everything picks up again in the chorus. So let me just play that few seconds.
And then come with me, yeah. We can do anything.
Very understated snare fill there, literally just a couple of hits, nothing fancy. Vocals are doing kind of this pickup, and I think this happens in most of the song sections where the vocals kind of pick up into the next section. This is another little great trick you can use in your songwriting and production. So you always want something that's kind of pushing the listener forward, driving the song forward. In this case, a lot of it is in fact the vocals. Great vocalists, by the way, Khalid and Haley, I believe that's how you say it. Halsey. Speaking of some of the credits, I looked up the writing credits, and all these guys, Benny Blanco, as well as these guys, and really the singers too, they're all on the writer credits, but also Ed Sheeran shows up here. So that's kind of cool. Moving on, what else can I tell you that's interesting here? Well, I have a lot of stuff I want to go over. I'll just mention it kind of, I'll kind of round out the arrangement and production a little bit. One thing to note about the guitar, it's definitely layered with another instrument. Towards the end here, it goes back to just being its own thing without this other layer.
Eastside.
And you can tell in the intro it has more of this kind of vibey pad underneath. That has those kind of nice delays. It's another thing you can play with, you know. Don't think that your layering has to be static. You can have layers come in and come out during the song for various effects. Another interesting effect, there's some nice automation, I think, on the delay line. If you listen to the intro, there's a couple of accents there on the phrase where delays are kind of emphasized, as well as the delay rhythm is kind of varied. So it's not just a straight 8-note delay. There's some kind of rhythmical thing going on there. I don't know if they use the multi-tap delay or they just split it into 2 tracks and use 2 delays, or maybe they just kind of hand-drawn the delay in, which some mix engineers would do, some producers would do. But that's another nice takeaway. You can add the interest by kind of varying the rhythmic element. So in this case, the delay, you can add automation, obviously, both to delay volume, but also maybe to the delay kind of, I would say kind of the note length of the delay. So if we listen to the first few seconds. I don't know if you can hear it, but it kind of goes like doo-doo, doo-doo, doo-doo. It's not just straight 8 notes. It's a nice little shtick, you know what I'm saying? Think about using stuff like that. And then the one last thing I'll mention is the guitar loop itself. It makes a very nice subtle use of this kind of very common guitar playery sound, which is the sweep over the strings when you're moving your hand. So if you can only hear it in one place of the phrase, but I think it's a very effective device to inject more kind of acoustic, folksy vibe to this song, which I think you kind of want to do in these kind of songs that have a lot of electronic elements. It just adds some kind of extra, soul, extra vibe to it. So let's just listen to that. That right there, you see where it kind of slides up over the string, and in fact that's emphasized once this electric bass comes in, which basically just kind of doubles that melody on the bass note, and it sounds to me like it's doing the same thing with that slide.
I know your daddy didn't like me much, and he didn't believe me.
Really cool effect, again, understated, but adds some kind of, I don't know how to call it, some kind of nice vibe and kind of more intimate acoustic feel to the whole song. So definitely what you can take away from this to your own songs, whatever it is you're doing, it can be, urban music, pop. It's always nice to add some kind of acoustic element to make the whole thing just sound more intimate, more acoustic, more like musician-y, more like a live instrument being played, to kind of break apart the whole programmed sound that is very easy to get into. There's a lot more I can go into. Obviously, I didn't even talk about the lyrics. I didn't really talk about the literary structure. That one is also, if you're into the songwriting rather than the music production, check it out. I think what you'll find is that the verse pretty much follows this kind of structure where there's 2 bars of the main melodic idea, another 2 bars repeating it, another 2 bars kind of going a little up, and then another 2 bars which are kind of summing everything up and kind of going back down and more towards the root. And I think this is pretty much the case for every section of the song. So if you listen to the kind of melodic development in the verse, in the pre-chorus, in the chorus, I think you'll find that in all of them, that's pretty much the case. Let's just kind of listen to the maybe the first verse just to kind of see if you guys can see what I'm talking about.
When I was young, I fell in love. We used to hold hands, man, that was enough.
That was number 1, right?
When I was young.
Whoop. Let me skip right here.
Then we grew up, started to touch, used to kiss underneath the light on the back of the bus.
Right, so that's pretty much repeating the same melodic idea. Now we're going into some kind of development going up.
I know your daddy didn't like me much, and he didn't believe me when I said you were the one.
And now we're closing it back, kind of going back down.
Every day, she found a way out of the window to sneak out late. She used to meet me on that.
And then we got the pickup into the pre-chorus. Speaking of the pre-chorus, I think that's kind of the hook of the song. Obviously, the name of the song is the phrase that's being hit here, but one interesting thing to think about in terms of songwriting, feels to me like the memorable hook is the pre-chorus rather than the chorus, and the chorus is more of just the dancey energy part. So I think in any kind of clubby sort of, pop, club, EDM kind of mix, you want both the memorable lyrical element as well as the just more full-blown energy, makes you want to dance kind of thing. And I think they tried to hit on both by having the pre-chorus kind of be the more catchy hook and having the chorus be just the more full out kind of, full blast energy thing. Check it out, see if you agree. I might be wrong, but that's kind of how it sounds like to me. A few quick mix notes, and again, you can do a whole thing about just the mix or just the arrangement, but I think this is a good song where everything really works together, and this is a good point again to take home. Like, arrangement, production, and mix go hand in hand. So especially nowadays, it's really the fact that you can really do them completely separately. I would say this song is very well produced and arranged in a way that lends itself very nicely to being mixed very well as well. Obviously. Couple of things I'll just point out quickly, and these are also a couple of tricks you guys can use if you don't know them. When you're listening to a song, trying to break something apart, whether it's for sound design or for just kind of figuring out the overall mix, try and see if you have some tool you can use to kind of listen to different frequency bands in solo. I use Ozone. You don't need to go quite as far. You can use any kind of multi-band compressor from Ableton, or even just an EQ and set up some band or a filter. This is nice because you can really home in on the low frequencies, the high frequencies, the low mids, high mids. Let me just point out a couple of things. I think the low mids are just exceptionally smooth and, focused. So if I play you like the chorus, which is the highest energy part, I think you'll agree that it's just, there's so much room just for the kick and kind of the upper harmonics of the bass and the vocals. The rest of the stuff is really kind of not taking a lot of space in here. Check it out.
We can do anything. put a mind to it. Take your whole life and you put a line to it. My love is yours if you're willing to take it. Give me a heart, the set gonna break it.
So, beautifully mixed. But having said that, I think beautifully arranged as well. If you'd have crammed a bunch of pads and stuff in there, it all take up this kind of 200 to 400, 800 hertz range. You really mess up your lower mids, and then things just sound muddy. If you listen to a lot of modern mixes, I think you'll find that they all sound really full, which kind of instinctively makes you want to go when you're trying to replicate that and just add a bunch of stuff in that range. But really, a lot of times the fullness comes from having that range just be really focused and kind of be very selective about which elements take up space there, and then make those elements sound really big in there. And in this case, I think it's pretty much the kick, some of the bass, the vocals. So that's another great takeaway about just kind of overall mixing of this kind of music. Another interesting exercise you can do whenever you're breaking apart songs like this and looking more into the mix is listen to the side. So I don't know if you guys are about mid-side, if you know all about it. If not, look it up. But basically, it's a way to kind of and a lot of modern mixes are done that way, to isolate only the stereo information or only the mono information of a track. And you can essentially listen inside. This is going to sound out of phase. In a way it is. But what this reveals is a lot of the things that are only happening on the sides. And this is a great way to kind of try and see if you can pick some interesting mixing and production techniques. I'm just going to play a couple of sections real quick. Couple of things immediately jump out to me. Obviously the vocals, so that means the vocals have a very nice kind of stereo feel. They're not monophonic, not a big surprise there. Most productions would do something with them. They're not very washy either though, so one takeaway is, if you're using reverbs, delays on your vocals to kind of add some stereo, listen inside, make sure you're not adding a bunch of washiness. Another thing that's pretty apparent is that the subs are not in the sides. A very common technique nowadays, just take everything under, say, 100 hertz, 150 hertz, make it completely mono. It's just going to make it sound better. Large speakers will have an easier time replicating it. It'll sound more focused. There's no real point in trying to make this kind of sub or low bass information stereo, because our ears don't really perceive directionality in those frequencies. Having said that, you do pick up a little bit of a reverb of, I'd say, kind of the upper bass. So that does give it some width. So that's something you can play with. See if you can kind of take your reverbs, apply them, tastefully to your bass, and just maybe the upper range, a little bit, mix it in, gives it a little bit of a width. Listen again. You can kind of hear just the accent notes on the kick, really, now that I'm listening to it. So it's kind of like these little but little bassy stabs that go with the kick, and kind of give it a nice stereo feel. So that's a cool trick you guys can use to make your track sound bigger too. Last thing maybe on the mix, and again, I'm really skimming over, but I want to make this video useful kind of on a high level way for you guys. So if you listen to the high frequencies, one thing for me is that they're just very controlled. So think about how you're compressing your higher frequencies. I think a lot of mix engineers, what they do, they just route the high frequencies into their own bus, one way or another, whether parallel or by kind of using some kind of multi-band split, and then just make sure that they're very well behaved. There's no weird kind of jumps in volume. Everything is just pretty tight and kind of around this average level. This level can go up between sections. So I think if you listen to the verse, the pre-chorus and the chorus, you'll notice that the average, the RMS around the high frequencies goes up, but then it doesn't kind of vary a lot around that RMS level. So if I play just a few excerpts from the different sections.
When I was young.
Hold up, it doesn't sound to me like we're on the right. Yep. All right. So if I play this, you can see we're kind of hovering around this at most, right? Pretty low, pretty well controlled. Goes up a little bit now when it goes up. Pre-chorus. A little higher maybe. Not by much. Chorus. Definitely more high frequency content here, right? still very nice, well contained, kind of tamed. There's no weird stuff happening. Takeaway for you guys: check out your snares and hi-hats. It's very easy nowadays with digital samples and then all the processing you add on top of it to create these kind of build-ups in the high frequencies that you might not even realize are there if you're listening on big speakers in your room that kind of accentuate the mid frequencies or the low frequencies and kind of mask all this high sparkle that keeps getting added up as you limit things, as you compress things, as you EQ things. So one thing you can do is always reference in small earbuds. That's one thing you can do because those actually accentuate those. So if you're listening on iPhone earbuds, you'll definitely hear it if your mix is way too brittle or too sharp. But then if you do this kind of mix kind of analysis thing, see if you can tell how they kind of balance that out, where the highs are kind of averaging it, and then how are they moving around that average. And I think you'll find that they're pretty well controlled and that there's not too much variety in how loud or how soft things go in those upper frequencies. So I think I'll finish with that. I'm going to share my notes where I go a little bit into some more details here and there, but that's pretty much it. And let me just kind of try and summarize it with a few takeaways and some exercises that you can apply on your own music. So main takeaway for me is you can absolutely create a hit song around a single 2-bar instrumental loop. You adapt the song form accordingly. Don't go too long, cut what needs to be cut. You can still have your verse, pre-chorus, chorus, but maybe don't go into a third double chorus or, long intros, long outros. You can create a lot of interest in movement by layering, by adding some automation effects. In this case, it was a lot of interesting, subtle kind of tweaks to the delay, both timing as well as volume. Lead melodies changes a lot. I talked a little bit about how there's this kind of literary form going on where you have 2-bar phrase repeated again, then developed, and then summed up. So it's kind of this 2-bar, four 2-bar kind of sets. And this is true for every section. And if you look at the sections, then I think you'll find that the melody overall of the verse and the chorus are kind of similar, and the pre-chorus is kind of different. That's a nice way to add variety. So the instrumental loop is the same, but really the melody changes between those sections. So that's one way to keep the listener interested. Taking out the drums, we talked about that. A very simple way to just kind of create these drops in energy, which end up creating this energy buildup once you bring them back in. I didn't really play a lot of that for you guys, but there's some subtle use of different reverse or like these swoosh effects and cymbals. I'll play a couple of quick ones. I'm still doing this. These are all slightly different reverse loops, which is pretty interesting. Another little trick you can use. Change things up. Don't use the same effect throughout the song. Same is true for the cymbals, by the way. Eastside, they're all slightly different crashes or cymbals that are used to kind of accentuate certain parts of the song and bring in a little higher frequency energy. So I think between those two, those are great examples where you can add a little variety and again make things more interesting and more energetic. Study your genre well. I think in this case they certainly did that. So a lot of the kind of interest comes from these glitchy vocal effects, very much a hallmark of this tropical house style. The kicks are done very well. The bass is sidechained. Obviously, I didn't even mention that, but I think it kind of goes without saying nowadays. The kicks are just, I don't know if they learned it themselves or they just picked a really nice sample, but definitely this sample is the kind of kicks that you have in these tropical house tracks. It has a nice punch, has nice presence. We talked about that little trick you can use with the offsetting the body and the bottom of that kick. And then finally, listen to the whole mix and try and tell by yourself that I didn't even cover the vocal production or the vocal sound that much, which again is a whole thing by itself. But the vocals are front and center, obviously. So always keep in mind they're the most important part of the mix. You want to make sure that they're very well understood, that they're present, that they're bright, that they're no other element is clashing or competing with them, that you can clearly make out the words, especially the hook. These songs, the idea is that people will catch this and be able to kind of sing along with it, at least a few of the key phrases, if not the whole thing. So keep that in mind. And I think if you listen to the whole mix, obviously beautifully done, but the vocals are definitely kind of the the brightest element on the average across the mix, and definitely are given the most, you kind of feel that, the most treatment and attention to make sure that they're front and center. They have stereo width, they have some nice effects, but even if you listen to the mono mix, you'll see that it was just beautifully recorded, beautifully done, produced, they were given a lot of attention, and rightly so. So that's another big takeaway. A few exercises you can take to try and take what's done here and apply it in your own songwriting. So I'll share anything that you guys find useful. I'm happy to share this little Ableton template. You can use this as a template for writing your own tune. So here's a fun exercise. Try and just literally build your own 2-bar instrumental loop and just use this kind of structure to add interest. So obviously don't just copy what these guys did, but try and create your own 2-bar loop. Add some interesting layering, add some interesting automation on effects, bring in elements the same way they did, right? So maybe you bring in a bass here, maybe you bring in the subs here, you got some percussion loop, top loop, you bring in the kick. Like, just try and take this as kind of a form or a structure and literally use that to write your own song. It kind of feels like being a copycat, and in a way it is, but if you're the one who is injecting the actual content into it, you're not really copying anything. You're just learning how these guys craft their hits. And there definitely is some formula and some logic and some kind of devices that you can use over and over here. So it's very worthwhile studying them and applying them in your own songwriting. Try and write this 2-bar loop. Try and write this verse, chorus, pre-chorus melodies. See if you can come up with these different melodies that kind of follow the same structure I mentioned. So, 2-bar kind of loops within each section. That's one way to think about it. And then just try and see if you can kind of keep yourself interested if you're listening to it. How can you make this song, even though it's based on a 2-bar loop, interesting throughout? And obviously the vocals are a big part of it, but I'd bet you that even if you take the main vocals out, all these little elements and these little developments and the way high frequencies, low frequencies are being brought in and out, those all create interest. So even if you listen to the instrumental, it would keep you interested. Think about that when you're building your own loops. And then finally, if you're into sound design and production, definitely try and put more emphasis on the reverse engineering of the various sounds. So, I really didn't do that in this case. I was more interested about the whole kind of songwriting and just arrangement as a whole. But having said that, the kick kind of stood out to me. So I played around with it and I tried to recreate it. I ended up with this chain that you can see right here, where I have this low kick that I pretty much synthesized myself with this plugin. I have this kind of kick body that sounds to me more like an acoustic kick. I have this little kind of hi-hat on the top. I do a bunch of EQing. I use the Ableton 10 drum bus, which just kind of compresses and adds some grit to it, some saturator, some transient designer to make it a little tighter, some limiter, again, to add a little bit of a crack and kind of volume to it. So I actually went through a fair amount of processing here. I think I ended up with a pretty cool bass drum that sounds kind of like what they did. Not exactly, but if you're into sound design, definitely challenge yourself. Try and listen to these tracks. As I mentioned, one cool trick you can do is definitely use something like Ozonate's dynamic processor, or anything that will let you basically isolate the different frequency bands as well as mid-side. That's going to be your friend when you're trying to reverse engineer sounds or mixes, and keep an eye on the level. So, keep an eye where are the low frequencies peaking, where are the mids, where are the highs. Going that way will help you kind of craft sounds that sound more and more like professional mixes. And you might realize suddenly that you've been putting too much emphasis on the subs but not paying attention to the high frequencies, or vice versa. The more you do this kind of exercise, the more I think your ear will become trained along with your eyes, and the whole thing. So definitely, I want you guys to take what I did here and try and apply it to other songs that you like. You won't get a lot of benefit just from listening to me talk about what I did here. So that's pretty much it. I hope this was useful to you. I'm going to share some content. I'll share this template. I'll share that kick I made, which I think is pretty cool. I'll share a couple other links, obviously, the song link. Let me know what you think. Let me know if you want more of these. Let me know if you want more stuff about the songwriting or the production or the mix or the sound design. I mean, each one of those things is endless. And I didn't even talk about vocal production or songwriting in terms of lyrics or any of that stuff. So there's a lot to cover here. Hopefully you got a lot out of this one. See you later.